Mars conjunct Pluto. Mars is about to conjoin Pluto and enter Aquarius tonight at, I think it's like 11 something p.m. my time. So it's just a few hours away. Mars, our malefic master of malice. He's going into Aquarius just before midnight, I guess. And since he's entering Aquarius, that means he's going to conjoin Pluto, right? What's Pluto? Our denizen of dominance, isn't he? And Pluto right now is at 0 degrees, right? 43 minutes. And we see Mars. You see, Mars has just entered Aquarius there. Beautiful. It's my first house, right? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this means and maybe talk about a couple brief horoscopes for each rising sign. So we'll go through really quick. But first of all, what does Mars mean in astrology? I mean, he's our aggression, right? He's our drive. He's violence, conflict. He's also injuries and illnesses, which is where we get some of the meaning of the sixth house from. He's also valor, right? Being valiant. He's courage. And he's victory. And then what does Pluto mean, right? Pluto is will and power, domination. He's also wealth, death, destruction. He's like Shiva, you see, in Indian mythology. Hidden things from the depths and precious things from below the earth, like gems and minerals and oil. And Pluto got a lot of his symbolism from Pluto, right? The Greek god of the underworld who slowly replaced Hades, right? Same fucking thing. Also Plutus, who is the Greek god, the personification of wealth, you see. Think about the word plutocracy, right? That's a government that's run by the wealthy, isn't it? Sound familiar? And then Pluto was also discovered around the time atomic energy was becoming a thing. So we see Pluto associated with nuclear power and unleashing the hidden power of the atom, both as energy and as a weapon. We also see Pluto sort of digging up the dead, don't we? Yielding discoveries of that which is long past. Right? Think of old bones, archaeological things. Now, when we see these two joined together by transit in a conjunction, we primarily see what? Struggles for domination. Last time that Mars conjoined Pluto was March 2nd of 2022. Like, this was literally a week before February 24th, right? Which was what? When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Mars was approaching its conjunction with Pluto. It was just a few degrees away. And the invasion of Ukraine is such a Mars-Pluto event because essentially Russia was trying to, what? And force them into submission. Dominance, right? Meanwhile, right, the US immediately tried to do the same thing to Russia as a response. I mean, for example, countries of the world, internationally, led by the United States, imposed very crippling sanctions on Russia, right? With good reason, of course. But still, they were using, or we were using, I suppose, financial pressure to force them into submission. That's very Plutonian, isn't it? Then on March 1st, during his State of the Union address, President Biden called out Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, saying basically like, yo, bruh, you fucked up. Right? But just 2 days after that, Russian troops seized the largest nuclear plant in Europe. And if you remember at the time, US officials were scared because, they were thinking, gosh, this could be a meltdown to rival Chernobyl. But you can see how transits like this often spark big events, and these events carry on for some time, right? Mars has a cycle of about 2 years, right? Takes him about 2 years to round the zodiac. So it's like this conjunction that's happening today represents the culmination of this previous Mars-Pluto cycle. I think the situation in Ukraine is about to change drastically. I'm just not sure what. I think we'll see more violence before we see less. But there's a culmination of something going on. Another interesting event that I thought was cool was, so around the time this was all happening in 2022, there was a ship of a famous explorer named Ernest Shackleton, and it was rediscovered in Antarctica after having sank in 1915. You see, so bringing shit up from the depths, from the past. And then a few days after that, right, Johns Hopkins University announces that the global death toll from COVID surpassed 6 million. Right? This is, Pluto's dominance. This is the dominating illness, right? Mars is illness. And then the day after that, Florida passes their Don't Say Gay bill, which is basically a violent suppression of the LGBTQ community. Again, trying to force us all into submission. And it's not the kind of submission that we like. Well, what about your natal charts? What if you have this aspect in your birth chart? Well, number one, these people know how to get what the they want. In fact, they get laser focused on what they want. And they get very impatient about getting it. Sort of like a predator stalking her prey. I think of, you ever see Alice in Wonderland? Remember the walrus and the carpenter? Yeah. The walrus and the carpenter, they befriend a dozen oysters, don't they? Succulent, succulent oysters with lemon and horseradish. But they're still alive at this point, okay? Of course, the walrus and the carpenter intended to eat them. But while the carpenter was preparing, all the stuff to cook the oysters, the walrus just ate them all raw, which is how I would eat them, right? With lemon and horseradish. He couldn't help himself. It is kind of a selfish placement, isn't it? But you see the sort of thing I'm indicating here. It's like that intense drive and hunger. And just, take what it wants. Now, some celebrity examples of this are Robert Downey Jr., right? And you can see the Plutonian experience he had. He went to hell and back earlier in his career, right? From drug addiction and alcohol abuse, only to be reborn as Iron Man, right? That revived his career and made him one of the highest paid actors in the world. Talk about Pluto, right? His tenacity and drive, though, Mars, is what gave him the power to claw himself out of the depths of despair. Oh, and one of my favorites, Marisa Tomei. And she actually dated Robert Downey Jr. too. Very interesting. But think of her character in My Cousin Vinny, right? Do you ever see My Cousin Vinny? Ms. Mona Lisa Vito, right? Oh my goodness. Remember how impatient she sounded when she was talking about her biological clock ticking? Her whole character throughout that movie is very Mars Pluto, right? Where she's like, yo, that's a bullshit question. Yeah. There was no Chevy Bel Air with the whatever, you know. I don't remember all the lines, but it was very sort of like the, remember Joe Pesci says, Your Honor, may I request to treat this witness as hostile? That's the Mars Pluto thing. It's the hostility. You know, it's refusing to submit in many ways and imposing your own power. Last year, though, it was interesting that Marisa Tomei was attending a party, you know, a Broadway after party. And as she was leaving, a bunch of fans were demanding that she take selfies with them. And she's like, no, I'm not doing, gotta go. And they got really upset and aggressive, right? And so they had to call the cops and all this sort of thing. But it's just sort of indicative of the Mars-Pluto conflicts that we sort of get ourselves into. You know, power struggles. And then we have Eminem. Yes, I'm Sim Shady. Yes, I'm the real Sadie. Right? Now, similar to Robert Downey Jr., he had a messed up childhood too, surrounded by addiction and abuse. Slim Shady also had to claw his way out of the depths of hell to achieve international success, didn't he? He's also famous for being a hothead. Now, Marshall Mathers has repeatedly jumped off stage, or sorry, reportedly, but repeatedly too. Several times he's jumped off stage to fight heckling and taunting fans in the crowd, right? Now, it's funny because we think his Mars is in Libra, which is sort of, you know, using your words more than your hands. But when Pluto comes out, it's like, you know, damn. So, I mean, also look at all the feuds he's been into, right? Well, what about Mars and Aquarius? Well, we know what Mars is, don't we? But what about Aquarius? It's a Saturn-ruled sign, isn't it? And it's sort of like Saturn turned outwards, while Capricorn is Saturn turned inwards. Natives with Mars and Aquarius are often quite idealistic, aren't they? They're very concerned with how things should be. And they're very quick to call out injustice or unfair situations. Like, I think of Michelle Obama as an example, who famously called out mass food production for its lack of nutrition. Remember, she had this whole White House garden thing that she really pushed. And she was very big in supporting children's nutrition. I also think of Tupac Shakur, who famously said, what? We have money for war, but we can't feed the poor. You know? Aquarius is also forward thinking. And we see people who strive to change society. Like, I think of activist and actress Jane Fonda, right? Who was famous for her opposition to the Vietnam War, and most recently in her demonstrations against climate change. We also see whistleblowers who are committed to exposing the truth, like Julian Assange, who started WikiLeaks. Or another interesting one is Nicholas Copernicus, the famous 15th century astronomer, right, who became historically famous for saying that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. Well, we also see idiots who get intoxicated by conspiracy theories, people like Elon Musk or former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin or famous aviator Howard Hughes, right? Howard Hughes used to keep his own urine in jars all around his place, and he was too afraid to leave his apartment because he was afraid Freemasons were trying to get him. Well, we also just see other general weirdos like Christopher Walken. But we love Christopher Walken. But what does this mean for you in transit? What does this mean for you? Well, remember the key phrase here for Mars conjoining Pluto is power struggles. So the whole sign house that Mars is entering for you will indicate where these struggles take place. So let's look at each of the rising signs. Let's start with Aries. right? My dear Aries. So this means Mars is entering your 11th house to conjoin Pluto, isn't it? So the struggles here are primarily with people who try to help you, right? So don't shoot yourself in the foot, because what matters here is that we don't alienate ourselves. There might be a sense of wanting to get into struggles for dominance with friends, perhaps, because you feel like you are right, you see? But what you need to remember is that keeping alliances intact can be quite beneficial for you for the future. So be careful and don't alienate yourself, as I said, because these struggles can come back and bite you in the butt when you really need help. But how about Taurus Rising? So for Taurus Rising, this means Mars and Pluto are entering your 10th house, right? Or Mars is coming into your 10th house to conjoin Pluto. So these power struggles are happening at work, typically, or happening with bosses or authority figures, where you feel like other people are trying to control you. So instead, what do? You want to control them in reverse, don't you? There's a sense of violently wanting to maintain your autonomy or trying to get your point across and make yourself heard. This can oftentimes lead to us wanting to quit a particular job. But rather than doing that, oftentimes we have to see, right, how we can make that situation at work better, or how we can reconcile sometimes, because oftentimes it's our bosses or these associations we have that get us good recommendations for future positions. But anyway, for Gemini Rising, this is the 9th house emphasized. So when Mars enters the 9th house conjunct Pluto, we feel like we are the Messiah, don't we? We're always right. Our view of the world, of spirituality, of religion is the correct way. My way is the correct way. And this can get us into lots of conflicts and arguments around these sorts of ideals. And sometimes it's way more trouble than it's worth, isn't it? So before you find yourself embroiled in all these sorts of idealistic or ideological battles, ask yourself how worth it is, because you're probably not going to change anyone's mind, you see. Now for Cancer Rising, this is the 8th house. So of course we know the 8th house is debt or death, but we also know that it is debt. And so there are financial struggles that erupt as Mars goes into this house. Sometimes it feels like there are hidden expenses that come out of nowhere, right? These are more abrupt and not as difficult as the Saturnian ones, but still quite difficult because oftentimes it feels like we have a sudden expense that happens that we did not expect, or we've spent too much money. Our eyes get way bigger than our checkbooks, you see? So the trick and the lesson here is to learn how to restrain ourselves and to budget ourselves, to have a plan for how the month will go or the next several months, because we're going to be quite impulsive and we're going to have to refer back to that plan in order to remind ourselves not to screw ourselves for later. You see? Now then, Leo rising, all this stuff enters the 7th house. And we talked with a couple people earlier. All this stuff going into the 7th house is explosive when it comes to relationships. And we have to be quite careful during this time that we don't say or do things, or perhaps it's our partner that does, that could stimulate a bigger rift later. Some of the things that we could do or say during this time could erupt into a breakup if we're not careful. But sometimes these eruptions also make us more aware of problems that had been unaddressed below the surface, you see. So if you have conflicts, try and make them creative and reconcile quickly. If you want the relationship to survive, maybe you become aware that it shouldn't survive. and that you really, for your own sanity, need to move on. But then for Virgo rising, this is the 6th house, you see. When these guys go into the 6th house, we suddenly find that we have to take responsibility for things. Oftentimes, we start developing lists. We realize that there's all these things that we left undone. And Mars rejoices in the 6th house because he gets the drive to make it happen, to do things, you see. So that's quite important because you should use this energy here to get things done that you've been avoiding. Now, on the other hand, though, it can also cause burnout, and it can also get you sick. So please try and rest. It's very important because burnout, you'll get way less done. And getting sick, you have to recuperate. So it's better to take things evenly and measure it so that you don't pay for it more later. And then we've got Libra Rising, which gives us the 5th house, Mars entering here in Aquarius. And this is our children, right? The 5th house of children and sex. So on the one hand, if you're a parent, you'll see your kids get to be a real pain in the ass. Like, this is power struggles with the kids. They fight us every which way, right? They can't just let us enjoy life or get things done. They keep having to make things difficult, and they're very willful, but it will get better. Now, the other thing that happens while Mars is in the 5th house is we get very amorous. We really, really want some action. We want pleasure. And it can be quite frustrating because it's like we don't get enough. It's like, I need to have more. I need more. It's like how I feel right now. Different placement. And then we've got Scorpio rising, right? This is the 4th house that all this stuff is in. And this is typically power struggles with our parents, if they're still alive. If not, it usually is having to do with their legacy or our past. Sometimes it could have to do with our living situation, with landlords or roommates or things like that. But typically the 4th house is what? Our parents, our private lives, and our genealogy, our past, our origins. So it could feel like you need to make a break with your past in some way too. Maybe it's been feeling like a burden or weighing you down. You need to release yourself from that sort of thing in order to feel free enough to move on. But then for Sagittarius rising, we've got all the entourage in the 3rd house. And that's communication, siblings, extended family, our immediate community. So we do see struggles with family, like, not our parents. I mean, like brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, that sort of stuff. But very literally, it could also be our own sense of, it's also short journeys. We see lots of road rage, trying to dominate other people on the road, trying to dominate other people in our daily routines, or through media, social media and stuff too, or news media. There's a lot of aggression that comes out in our expressions, whether it's driving or communicating. But we will tend to say aggressive things and have harsh words. So once again, we need to be aware of not being so impulsive. Number one, because we could hurt other people, but number two, because we could hurt ourselves. And then we've got Capricorn Rising. And the entourage moves into the 2nd house of money once again. So the opposite of the 8th house. So this often indicates us being impulsive with spending money in general. It's not necessarily the big losses or the big expense, but it's us burning through our own resources not being mindful, wasting things. Sometimes it's retail therapy. Sometimes it's just like, oh, I'd really like to have that. But you have to be careful here because this will make your money scarce and you will regret it later. So once again, similar to the 8th house, plan yourself out, a budget or a limit of what you can spend that month so that you can attend to your expenses in the future. Don't be silly. And then for Aquarius rising, this is me and my people. All of our entourage is going into the 1st house. This is transformational, right? But also, we're going to get a lot of aggression and drive and conflict around our sense of self. You see, we get more confidence when Mars leaves the 12th house and enters the 1st. It's like we come out of isolation. We feel incredibly assertive. We feel powerful, dare I say. But once again, it makes us impulsive and we tend to rush around and we are very prone to accidents and hurting ourselves. So the key here is to take caution and to think before we act, because we don't want to, have to heal from some injury later. Can make life more difficult. So take your time, right? And before you just try and impose what you want on someone else, think about the ramifications. Think about consequences. Be mindful. Well, and then there's Pisces rising, and the entourage enters the 12th house, which is the isolating part. This is where we sort of retreat. This is where we feel lonely and agitated. In fact, we want people to leave us alone. We need our space right now, aggressively so. This is where we sort of have to face our own self-destructive tendencies. You see, when Mars goes through our 12th house, oftentimes we find ourselves going back to them, right? Whether it's, substances or anger or whatever, pushing people away. We have to face these difficult things. We have to face our tendencies towards self-destruction oftentimes. It's a regular occurrence that happens every couple of years. But you see, we have to weather through it temporarily. And then it brings us to the next phase where we get into the 1st house again and we're like, the impulse control goes out the window. So anyway, that's all important stuff. I'm going to clip this later, perhaps as a video, you see, for horoscopes and everything. But I hope it's useful to you right now as well.